Hi everyone. Welcome to my webinar, where I'm going to address the origins, events, and consequences of satanic panic, a mass moral panic that took America by storm in the 70s, 80s, and even bleeding into the 90s. We're going to be looking at the facts, disinformation, and impacts in order to get a comprehensive understanding of the satanic panic era and all of its moving pieces. So, first of all, what is satanic panic? In Sarah Cleary's extremely interesting article, Better Devil You Know, for the Edinburgh University Press, Cleary describes satanic panic as being the fear that America, or at least its white suburban middle class, was under a subversive form of attack from satanic forces. Basically, there was this intense media obsession with the threat of the occult, that satanic cults were covertly operating throughout the US, and there was an urgent threat to the country's safety and Christian values. However, the vast majority of allegations that rose during this phenomenon turned out to be completely baseless, sensationalized, and a product of disinformation. So let's go ahead and investigate how satanic panic came to be. So we're going to be going through my map over here with these arrows. You can follow my cursor. They are color-coded, so our green arrows mean facts. These kind of serve as sources of satanic panic. The red arrows over here and the blue are our disinformation and our impacts from these facts, from these sources. And you can see how these all kind of play into each other. All right, so let's get into this. The origins of satanic panic involve many moving pieces relating to the complex sociocultural climate of the 70s and 80s. I'm going to be identifying two pretty major facts that are a large piece of the puzzle that set the stage for satanic panic. So we have the rise of American evangelical Christianity, and we also have the rise of fear infotainment in the 70s and 80s. So you can see the impacts over here. These impacted each other. They played off each other, and they had a pretty circular impact, because on one hand, you have conservative right-wing Christian values becoming more and more rigid throughout the country. You also have those more narrow white suburban conservative middle class perspectives being blasted in the media constantly, which ultimately manifested in what I like to call, over here, an impact, Christian anxiety. So what is Christian anxiety? I'm going to call Christian anxiety any speculation of deviation to the conservative cultural norms. Anything that could be seen as a threat became absolutely sensationalized in the media. Why? Because fear is entertaining. It makes more and more people tune into the news channels, and ultimately it makes money. Another fact I'm going to point out, a pretty big player here, was the Charles Manson trial. We probably all know about the murderous Charles Manson cult, whose crimes occurred in the mid to late 60s. This was a massive case, and it left America both traumatized and also very intrigued with the idea of cult murders and Satanism. It caught worldwide attention and made Manson and his followers celebrities in the media. Many see the Charles Manson trial as an end to the peace and love 60s movement, setting a much darker tone for the new decade to come, and adding a newfound sense of skepticism and fear of harm that was not nearly as prevalent in the 60s. And although there was never conclusive evidence that the Manson cult murders had any connection to the devil or form of Satanism, the media and public eye drew its own conclusions, and many view the Manson cult murders as one of the clear catalysts here for satanic panic and the disinformation that followed the years ahead. So let's get into some of the immediate impacts of these facts, these background facts that we just looked at. Well, first, with the age of fear-based infotainment rising, Hollywood did what they could to capitalize off American fear. We have numerous movies all feeding into Satanism and the occult. We have the Amityville Horror movie over here from 1979, The Exorcist 1973, and the book Michelle Remembers. I'm going to say this is one of the big ones. It is a true story. I say that with quotations. It was written by a Canadian psychiatrist and his patient about her accounts growing growing up within a satanic cult, which was later all proven to be false and discredited. Why were these books and movies so popular? That comes back to evangelical Christianity and disinformation of fear that came from that. Horror movies have always been an outlet or a manifestation of human societal fear, and as I said, Republican white wing Christianity was bouncing off these fears and making up the majority of American politics. And we have another impact over here. What do younger generations do when they feel restricted or pushed one way or another by the older generations? They rebel. 80s America saw huge countercultures brought by the new generation that came, and they can all be attributed to escapism and the urgent need to break free against these rigid standards brought by the rise of evangelical Christianity and brought by their parents that were experiencing Christian anxiety from all of these above things. So we can see this especially in 80s rock and roll over here. We can see this in punk and goth culture. We can see this in Dungeons and Dragons and Ouija boards. You can see the Stranger Things reference over here. Seeing younger generations' deviancy from the conservative American values resulted, again, in Christian anxiety. So you can see this is a cycle. And with all of these factors, we still have the news media system making extreme success and profit off growing Christian anxiety, and they're wasting no time bringing cases involving satanic cult conspiracies and allegations into the public eye. So now, Americans are involved in a nationwide witch hunt for people or organizations that could be secretly operating as satanic cults. The most common fear was that these secret cults were out there to sexually or physically abuse American children. This fear that children were being harmed deeply fed into the American news media circus over here, and then that's how many cases of disinformation got brought to light. So there were many cases of disinformation that came out of Satanic Panic era. I'm going to point out two of the most famous players here. These are disinformation cases that came out as a direct result of media attention, sensationalism, and hearsay. We have the West Memphis Three, where three little boys here were brutally murdered outside their homes in a nearby wooded area. Their bodies were found, tied up, drowned, and I don't want to get into further graphics here. The West Memphis Police Department did not even do basic run-of-the-mill detective work like interviewing nearby residents or securely processing the scene and evidence. Instead, the WMPD skipped all reasonable steps of ethical investigatory work and concluded that a satanic cult must be responsible for the murders. The conservative Christian community of West Memphis all pointed their fingers at local teenage outsider Damien Echols. Echols was known for his alternative goth lifestyle, love for heavy metal music, and disregard for the norms of his town. He stood out and caused Christian anxiety for his deviant lifestyle. Actually, fun fact, Eddie Munson's character from Stranger Things is loosely based on Echols' story, obviously very loosely, but that is for a whole other webinar. Anyway, Echols, along with his close buddy Jason Baldwin, who was also known for his love of heavy metal, were immediately the scapegoats for the brutal murders of the boys, just as a consequence for being seen as different. We also have Jesse Miskelly, a mentally disabled local teenager who was coerced and bribed by detectives for confessing to the murder of the boys with Echols and Baldwin. Other witnesses, I say that also with quotations, made statements against the three teenagers, all later recounting their statements and admitting to being coerced by detectives. By the end of the highly sensationalized and publicized trial, Miskelly and Baldwin got 40 years to life in prison, and Echols was put on death row. It wasn't until 2007, 16 years later, that the case was reignited, and another 4 years in 2011, where it was determined that DNA evidence showed there was no tangible link between the men and the crime. They were finally released that year. Okay, now we're going to look at the McMartin preschool trial, which has been described as the longest and most expensive trial in the nation's history at the time. In 1983, McMartin's school in California received allegations of ritualized sexual child abuse. During the course of the case, the CII concluded that about 360 students from the school had endured sexual abuse carried out in satanic rituals. It was determined through hundreds of interviews with young children from McMartin. The children were encouraged and made to feel extra special coming forward, and one child who denied any abuse was called a scaredy cat by the investigator. After years of investigations, trials, and wrongful convictions, the case was eventually dropped and held no substantial evidence. The McMartin preschool trial has since been described as a widespread, volatile, hostile, and overreactive case. So the impacts of these cases and other disinformation that came out of Satanic Panic are abundant and everlasting. Most immediate I can point out are the plethora of miscarriages of justice that absolutely destroyed lives and ripped communities apart. In the case of the McMartin preschool trial, you can see Ray Buckey over here. Ray Buckey and two other teachers spent years behind bars before the charges were dropped, and they were left traumatized, not just by their community, but the whole world turning their back on them and accusing them of such sick acts of abuse. And you can see over here Damien Nichols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miss Kelly. They wasted their youth locked away for heartless, disgusting murder they were completely innocent of, punished for just for being different in a town that condemned anti-conservative lifestyles. Further, Steve Edward Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore, those were the innocent boys whose lives were stolen, never saw justice. If America was more focused on reality rather than sensationalized drama and typecasting, correct and ethical police investigatory practices would have taken place, raising the likelihood of bringing the true killer or killers to justice. On a wider scale, Satanic Panic left a dark legacy for unethical reporting, legal practices, and human rejection for anything that causes some sort of moral discomfort. To wrap up this presentation, Satanic Panic has a lasting influence on Western popular culture, with depictions of satanic cults, the devil, and demonic possessions being a common hit in mainstream entertainment. What we can take away from the infamous era of Satanic Panic are the irreversible dangers of unethical reporting, infotainment, hysteria, and moral rigidity. This brings me to the end of this webinar. Thanks for listening, and remember to stay objective. Thank you very much.